We're in a cultural moment that has unique challenges. And sometimes we may feel like we can never make a difference. But God can and will use us to impact others when we follow Him. Just think about it. He's planned your life so that He can use you for His glory at this time, in this place, in His mission. Like Esther, you were made for this moment.
Hey guys, how are y'all? All right, good. Oh, I got some clapping somewhere. I don't know, that's great. I'll take it. It's back here though, so thank you. Hey, glad you guys are here. Welcome, especially if you're new with us. I want to say a special welcome to you. Thanks for being here to close out our Esther series for today. So that's going to be great for us. But hey, before we do that, I want to give you a snapshot of where we're going over the next 3 or so months, okay? I want you guys to see where we're going here. After Esther is over, we're going to get into a series called Multiply. You know, you can see it back out there as you leave. Our strategy to make disciples includes making, shaping, and multiplying disciples, people who follow Jesus. Multiplication just means disciples who make disciples, okay? It's an ongoing thing. And so we're going to talk about what that looks like for us as a church. We're going to have to do some serious introspection for us and ask ourselves, are we really doing that with our lives? And then are we really doing that collectively? And if not, why not? And if not, how are we going to be able to live that way? And how are we going to start living as multipliers here in the world? Well, we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to lay out 3 big vision points for us as a church that we believe God is leading us to pursue in 2023 together. I'll share those during the Multiply series, so there you go. It's going to be happening in 2 weeks from now. We're going to have a guest speaker next week, and then we're going to get into Multiply the following week, and it's going to be really awesome for us. And that's including how that plays into Christmas for us, okay? So at Christmas time, we're going to have a special service like we did last year on Christmas Eve. Maybe we're starting a Christmas tradition here, but we're going to do it on Christmas Eve. So Friday, December 23rd, make sure that you are marking your calendars down for that and you plan to be there because you're going to use that day, hopefully. That's why we do these kinds of things. Honestly, it's a work day for me, right? Like I'm going to have to come to work on December 23rd. I don't want to just waste that day. We're doing that so that we can reach Roanoke because Christmas, we kind of have this philosophy of big days as a church. And there's a few big days that we want to invite people to church. People in our culture will still come to church if they're invited on certain days. Christmas is probably the biggest day. You invite somebody, the most heathen person in Roanoke will come to a Christmas service if they're invited, right? There's Christmas trees, there's caroling. So I want you to use that big day for yourself. That's why we're doing that kind of thing as a church. If you've shared the gospel with somebody this year, if you've engaged somebody with the gospel, or you've been praying for somebody, now's the time to use that opportunity to invite them in. I hope that you will utilize that to be a multiplier. Don't be disobedient and keep putting it off if you haven't done that yet. We talked at the very beginning of the year about who's your one person that you're doing that with. Well, now's that time. This is the end of the year. It's the culmination of the who's your one kind of concept. We've been talking about being a hospitable church all year long. We want people to feel Jesus' love through us, right? Well, you know what? Now's the time. Don't miss out on this opportunity. So listen, if you're making your travel plans and you've already planned to be somewhere else on the 23rd, change them. Be here. This is what we're here for. And we could see close to 150 people here if we'll all participate and invite. This entire room seats 188 as we have it laid out right now. This room could be filled up. Amen. But that's going to rely on you, right? And me, as I invite as well. I have 5 neighbors around me that we're going to try to invite, their families. So it's probably about 10 to 11 people total. That's just with our family. So I hope you guys will do the same thing. And I hope you'll be thinking about who you can invite to that. And then finally, after that, just one more point here. At the beginning of the year, we're going to have 2 weeks off. 2 Sundays. We're going to take 2 Sundays off because Christmas falls on a Sunday. We're having that day off. And then the following week, the 1st, January 1st, starts on a Sunday. So we're going to take that week off as well. So you guys have a good break where you can rest and relax. And then, exactly. And then we're going to get back into it with a vision series, and we've been trying to create this rhythm for our church as well. The vision series for 2023, we're going to lay out what that looks like for us. This year, as I've said, we focused on hospitality. Next year, we're going to focus on what it looks like to be dependent on God. Because, listen, if people don't see that we are feeling Jesus' love for us, if we don't feel that and experience that ourselves, then they'll never feel his love through us, right? And so we have got to make sure that as a church, we are dependent on God. And so we'll lay that all out in January. It's going to be really good. That's where we're going for the next 3 months. I hope that helps you guys who are type A and need to know all of that. But listen, I hope you lock in with us over that 3 months. Now's not the time to just get distracted and get busy. We're here on mission, and we're going to multiply, and you can be a part of that if you choose to. Amen. Okay? So let's just keep that in mind today. But let's go into Esther chapters 8 through 10. That's where we're going to be. If you want to turn there, find it on your device. And while you're turning there, while you're finding that, to end out Esther with us, does anybody follow professional cornhole? That's an odd question, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe for some of you, it's not an odd question. Apparently, I just read this in an article this week. Apparently, there's been some allegations of cheating in the cornhole world. It's a big scandal going on. Some players are boiling or sanding or hammering or soaking their beanbags in vinegar in pursuit of a lighter and slicker toss. Okay? Now listen, this is what the news source that I read this week said. One aficionado was quoted as, that's how they labeled him, aficionado. Okay, so I don't know what that means. He's quoted as saying this: "I think it's funny that anyone believed it would be all friendships and rose petals forever in cornhole. Now the dirty underbelly is being exposed." Okay? Stakes are apparently high in cornhole. I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. And when things like that happen, it obviously makes people question that community, right? Like people are questioning everything in cornhole now. It makes people lose their faith in communities like that, perhaps, when they see the dirty underbelly of what's going on, the brokenness that's there, and it erodes trust, right? Well, listen, today, I guess on a serious note, I don't know. I mean, one of the topics that comes up in our story, it might be that dirty underbelly for some people in the Christian faith. They might look at this topic today and see, that's why I don't believe in this thing that you guys call the Christian faith, in this Bible. It's the dirty underbelly. There's some things that are exposed here. It might cause people to lose faith. We're going to see that God is allowing his people to kill 75,000 men, women, and children here in this story across the Persian Empire at the time. And that sounds really bad, right? I mean, it might feel unfair. It might even feel wrong, evil, some people would say. Vengeance. That kind of thing comes to mind here. People might even be asking, what kind of God would allow that to happen? What kind of God is this in the Bible that would allow this and say that it's good for his people to kill all these folks? Well, maybe that's exactly the reason that you don't believe. Maybe you're watching online, listening online. Maybe you're here in person. I don't know every single person in the room. And that's the exact reason you don't believe in God, because of this violence and vengeance that we seem to see here in the Old Testament. You can't quite square that with what everybody says about God being a God of love and a God of forgiveness, a God of the New Testament, somehow different than the Old Testament. I like the God of the New Testament. I don't like the God of the Old Testament. Well, listen, if that's where you're at, I think this story here in Esther will show us the kind of God that we're dealing with. And it's really not the way that it seems on the face of it. It's not a vengeful, unfair, immoral God, despite what our limited perspective might be able to see here at first glance. This is a God of love. And it's a God who fights for his people, a God of grace toward a people that constantly reject him. He's going to give them rest from their enemies, even though they don't really deserve it. And so, how does he do that? Well, it's by his grace, and I'll explain what that means as we get into the text. But for now, you can write this down as our main point for today. God's grace conquers our greatest enemy. That's what I want you to take away from this sermon today. God's grace conquers our greatest enemy, and we'll talk about what that is as we get into the text. He gives all of his people rest from their enemies, including us, if we're one of his people. And our greatest enemy is sin and death in the world. And the rest that he gives is not a fleeting rest. It's lasting. It's eternal. It's an eternal rest that he gives. It lasts forever. And if you're still thinking, yeah, but 75,000 people dead, how does this work out? Because God's not either big enough or powerful enough or loving enough or forgiving enough to save them. Something like that. Let me just encourage you to listen today and really lock in, because I get that. On the face of it, it does sound really bad. It sounds not right. And it's not. It's not good, at least. Now, right, wrong, justice, unjust, we'll talk about all that and the source of all that here in just a minute, but at least it sounds bad, right? Well, in Esther's story, it shows us a few things that help us grasp what's going on there in those kinds of moments of extreme violence, we might say, when we see God doing violence to people. And it should ultimately point us to how God will give us rest from our greatest enemy today. All right? So that's where we're going here. Where we left off last week, we saw some poetic justice. Haman was killed on the very pole that he'd planned to use for Mordecai. And Esther, she found favor from the king. He extended his scepter to her multiple times to make sure that she could save her people, save herself. I'm sure you go back and listen to the sermons from this series if you've missed a few or haven't been here for a few weeks. It builds up to this final picture here that we have in the text. And as we enter this part of the story today, we see a great reversal begin to happen. We talked about that we introduced it last week, but now we're seeing the reversal begin to take place. This is what it says in chapter 8, verse 2. The king removed his signet ring he had recovered from Haman that he'd just killed, and he gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put him in charge of Haman's estate. So the reversal begins, right? There's a reversal of everything bad that's happened to Esther and to Mordecai and to the Jews that are in the story here. Their enemies seem to be blessed in chapters 3 and 4, right? Everything was going for Haman. He's an Agagite. If you remember what that means, it's God's enemy. Yeah, the enemy of God's people. And so everything seems to be going right for him and all of the people that would be enemies of God. And now everything's reversing. In chapters 6 through 8, we see all of that take place. And we see in chapters 8, 9, and 10 how that carries itself out across the empire. And what this has done, it's the author, who's anonymous, by the way, he wrote this so beautifully, or he or she, wrote this so beautifully because it's in this beautiful structure that helps us understand the point. Now, anytime we're reading the Bible, we need to understand what the author's intention actually was when he was writing it. What was he trying to communicate? What were they trying to communicate in this story? Well, there's a structure behind all of this. And if you go through and look at the literary structure, it's called a chiastic structure. And it's just paralleled. It goes like A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime. I don't know if you want to see it like that, right? It goes A, B, C, C, B, A. That's the structure of this story. It plays itself out like that. So let me just walk you through some of the major points just so you understand and see it here. It starts with the king giving Haman his ring in chapter 3, verse 10, because remember, Haman was honored instead of Mordecai. When Mordecai deserved it, Haman got the honor. And so the king in chapter 3 gave Haman his ring, his signet ring. Now that means he could speak on behalf of the king. And then Haman summoned the king's scribes right after that. And then letters were written and sealed with the king's ring by Haman. And then the Jews, even the women and the children, were to be slaughtered on a specific date and their wealth to be taken as plunder from the enemies of the Jews. And then Haman's decree is published as law across the empire. Couriers go out in haste to the furthest reaches so that everybody knows. And the city of Susa is bewildered because of that. And then Mordecai responds by wearing sackcloth and ashes and goes through the city mourning and crying and ripping his clothes. Do you remember this part of the story? And then right after that, Haman's wife advises Mordecai's death, and that's when he erects the pole that he's going to hang Mordecai on. So that's kind of the structure all the way through. Now, go back and read it if you've forgotten this, but go back and read, and you can see that structure going on. And it looks like all is lost at that point, right? Because it looks like Haman's winning until the sleepless night happens. Remember the acid reflux that kept the king awake? Okay, that's what happened, right? And that just all hinges on this one seemingly ordinary moment. But right after that, what happens? Mordecai gets honored now. He gets the honor that he was deserved. And then instead of advising Mordecai's death, Haman's wife predicts Haman's downfall after that, right? You remember that in chapter 6, verse 13? She's like, well, you're in for it now. It's all changed now. And Mordecai is then given royal robes to wear. He's led through the city in honor instead of mourning, right? And then the king gives Mordecai Haman's ring after Haman has been killed on the same post that he erected for Mordecai. It's all reversing. Mordecai summons the scribes like Haman did. The letters that he and Esther write are sealed with the king's signet ring, so they speak on behalf of the king like Haman did. And the edict goes out that all the enemies of the Jews, even the women and the children, can be now killed on this specific date. All the language is exactly the same. If you go back and read everything from chapters 3 and 4, the language is the same in 6 through 8. It's all the same kind of language. And then Esther and Mordecai's decree is published as law across the land. Couriers go in haste across the empire. And the city of Susa, instead of being bewildered, is now rejoicing because of it. And the exact opposite of what Haman meant to happen, happens. Because the Jews overcome their enemies. The enemies of the Jews don't overcome them. So the structure of the story itself is showing us something that we need to understand through God's deliverance here. Though he's never given credit, right? God's never mentioned in the story. He's systematically reversing every wrongdoing that has been done to his people here. So the author is making this point, and you can write it down. God delivers his people through reversals. That's how he delivers his people. It's through reversals in the world. It looks like things are going one way, because they kind of are, and then God just does something. He just, boom, goes into it, changes it through something seemingly, like totally random, a sleepless night. Now, again, if you wrongly apply this to your life, we talked about this last week, you'll think that that's the prosperity gospel, right? You'll think that what the Christian faith is saying is if you believe in God, then all the good things will come to you. You've had it really bad, you're poor or whatever, and if you believe, then everything's going to go well for you the way that you want it to go, and that's the prosperity gospel. And that's not what this is. This is pushing us to see something about salvation history, the way that God works in the world, that the ultimate deliverance of God's people is going to come through a great reversal. That's not the way that you think it's going to happen. You think God should just come conquering the whole world, that he's going to destroy his enemies with violence, but that's not really how it happens. He's working behind the scenes. He's hidden, and he comes into the world in the most unassuming of ways to deliver his people. That's what Christmas is all about, right? That's why I'm looking forward to our Christmas service. But before we talk more about that, I want to get back into the story here, and we see that Esther and Mordecai, as they were given freedom to write into law whatever they wanted, they couldn't reverse Haman's original edict. Because once the king had spoken, whether it was Haman speaking on his behalf or not, you could not reverse that. That's how the law worked at the time in Persia. And so what they could do was they could supersede that with their own law. They could make a new law that encouraged the Jews to defend themselves. Let's just read it from chapter 9, verse 1. The king's command and law went into effect on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. On the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overpower them, just the opposite happened. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. In each of King Ahasuerus' provinces, the Jews assembled in their cities to attack those who intended to harm them. Not a single person could withstand them. Fear of them fell on every nationality. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the royal civil administrators aided the Jews because they feared Mordecai. For Mordecai exercised great power in the palace, and his fame spread throughout the provinces as he became more and more powerful. And the Jews put all their enemies to the sword, killing and destroying them. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, including, I'm not even going to try all their names, okay? I'm just not even going to try. So they were the 10 sons of Haman. They killed these 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. However, they did not seize any plunder. And then a little further down in verse 16, they said, the rest of the Jews in the royal provinces assembled, defended themselves, and gained relief from their enemies. So not just in Susa, but all across the empire, they killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not seize any plunder. Now, we're back to the problem we started with, right? How do we square this with who God is? How can a good God allow destruction and violence of men, women, and children on such a massive scale like this, seemingly bless his people because they did that? Well, listen, I'm going to give you 3 points here to consider. They're not comprehensive points. I have to caveat this, right? Every time I say this, I got to caveat it because I could talk forever. I could do a 4-hour lecture on why this could be the case and how this could play out. I'm going to give you 3 things, which is really more than 3 things because you'll see there's a bunch of things within each 3 thing, okay? So there's a bunch of things here, and I'm just going to give it to you in like a shotgun approach. It's just going to be a scattering of ideas and considerations. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want, hopefully, one of those things to land with you. One of those things to help you grasp onto so that you can say, yeah, I can see how God could potentially work through that. And listen, if you have any trouble with this, come down afterward and talk to one of our prayer counselors. They'd love to talk through that with you. Come talk to me after the sermon, and I'll try to help you through my thought process on this. But there are 3 things that we're going to talk about. The first is God's nature. Okay, the God of the universe, the creator God, whether we like it or not, has the right to build up nations and to tear down nations. And that's the very first thing to say here. Listen, Job 12 says he makes nations great and then he destroys them. He enlarges nations, then he leads them away. Psalm 7 says the one who examines the thoughts and emotions is a righteous God. God is a righteous judge and a God who shows his wrath every day. Psalm 22 says, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow down before you, for kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules the nations. Man, he's the potter, we're the clay. Paul makes this exact argument in Romans chapter 9. He can say it better than I can, so I'm going to read it at length. He says, is there injustice with God when he doesn't save people? He's talking about this exact issue. When God chooses not to save people, is there injustice with God? Absolutely not. For he tells Moses, I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then, it does not depend on human will or effort, but on God who shows mercy. For the scripture tells Pharaoh, I raised you up for this reason, so that I may display my power in you, and that my name may be proclaimed in the whole earth. So then, he has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. And you will say to me, therefore, why then does he still find fault? For who resists his will, right? Like, why is that somebody's responsibility? Why are they still responsible for their wrongdoing then if God's the one that's working behind the scenes? He says, on the contrary, who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? I mean, that's the answer that he gives here, guys. Will what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Or has the potter no right over the clay to make from the same lump one piece of pottery for honor and another for dishonor? And what if God, wanting to display his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience objects of wrath prepared for destruction? And what if he did this to make known the riches of his glory on objects of mercy that he prepared beforehand for his glory? In other words, what if he did it this way? Who are you to ask God and to question him? Man, that's something we don't really like, is it? That's not an answer that's really popular. But what I want you to see is it's God's world. That's the point here. It's God's world. It's not ours. I mean, we can rebel against it all we want. It doesn't make it any less true. Can a God like that not do what he wants in the world? A God who made everything and formed everything and holds everything by the word of his power together right now? We might not like it, but let me put it this way. A God that you can fully understand, that you can control, and that you're always comfortable with is not a God at all, right? That kind of God's a figment of your imagination. It's something you've created because you want to be able to control it. You want to be okay with it. But a God who created you, and a God who can control all things, and a God who's beyond your comprehension and understanding and control will necessarily make you feel uncomfortable. He just will. That's the nature of God. He will make you feel uncomfortable because he's not controlled by you. He controls you and everything else in the world. It's funny how spiritualists or New Age type folks in our culture today will say that our view of God's the one that's too small. That's what I find hilarious there. And I'm not trying to be ugly to those folks, but they'll say our view of God's too small because we believe in his judgment. And we believe that he's created things a certain way, and so somehow that makes us small-minded. But how small-minded do you have to be to think that you know the mind and heart of God and that you can speak on his behalf when there's been no revelation to you? Because listen, we didn't come up with that. The revelation isn't ours to dole out to the world in that sense that we control it somehow. We don't control the narrative. It's given to us in the Bible. And it's given to us really ultimately through Jesus and what he taught. Jesus talked about God's judgment and hell and wrath more than anywhere else in the Bible. That was Jesus' prerogative. So if he's the one that talked about it and we follow him, then we're just going to naturally have to believe what he taught. That's what it boils down to for us. So how small-minded do you have to be to say, I speak for God without any kind of foundation for how you can do that? I don't know. That's just a good question for me to ask. Because when I start to wrestle with this kind of stuff, I think, this is God's revelation. It's not mine. What this also does is it reveals the nature of God in his justice. So if you think God is somehow unjust in this, then you're not reading the story or the Bible very carefully because, like I've already said, the Jews were protecting themselves, especially in this case. That's generally how it was and how it played out in some way, shape, or form, whether it was on the offensive or the defensive when mass casualties occurred here in the Bible. But in this particular case, just dealing with what's in Esther, they were killing those who were seeking to do real harm to them. It was either kill or be killed in that sense. And if somebody's going to kill you or your family, is it not just that you stand up and kill them first? Now, nobody's saying it's a good thing to do that. Nobody's saying you want to do that. but it's at least a just thing to preserve your life and the lives of those that you care for. That's essentially what's going on in Ukraine right now. If anybody supports the war in Ukraine, then we feel this way. We feel like people have the right to stand up and defend themselves when somebody would do them harm, right? And if that kind of thing is right, then we have to see it as part of God's nature, because God is the arbiter of justice. And you can write that down as well, just so that we remember this. He's the one that defines what justice is. He's the one that defines right and wrong. And essentially, justice is this reversal concept that we see here in the story. It's the balancing of the scales, right? You think of Lady Justice who holds the scales and she's blind. But the scales will tip in one way or the other. And what it seems to be here happening in Esther is that it's tipping in the favor of God's enemies until it doesn't. And then God tips the scales back in favor of those whom he loves and he fights for. Why? Well, because he loves them. And that's another part of God's nature that we need to see. So not only is he the creator, not only does he define justice, but he also loves those whom he loves. I mean, that's what he said in Romans 9. In Esther, we see God behind the scenes taking care of and loving those whom are his people. And he gives them rest from their enemies because he loves them. And yeah, it's bad for the people who wanted to kill the Jews, right? That's bad for them. So it's good for God's people. It's good that they don't lose their lives. It's because God loves them and wants to give them rest. I think that's what's been most striking throughout Esther is that God calls this people his own. He loves this people, the Jews. And at every turn, if we go back and read the entire story, every single Jew in the story seems like a pretty bad Jew, right? They don't follow God's law. As a matter of fact, some of them even deny God. That's what Esther does, right? Mordecai gives really bad Jewish advice, not good Jewish advice at all, to Esther. And then they deny God. I mean, it just seems like they don't deserve God's deliverance, and yet he does it anyway. It's almost like he does it in spite of how rebellious they are, right? He loves them unconditionally. It's just incredible. The story is emphasizing that for us. So the nature of God is loving here as well, and he's forgiving, he's protective over his own people. That's what you have to see. It's important to see God's nature in this. But then another point to consider, see, I told you there was multiple points under each one, okay? But then another point here that we can write down is your morality, your sense of morality, and it plays into your sense of justice. Justice and morality are connected. We've talked about this before. We talked about it in our Pray for the City series. So you can go back and listen to some of those sermons there. But listen, the idea that we even have moral categories of good and evil is itself from God. Now, I know many people will try to say, no, that's not true, especially the atheists of the world, the atheists of the West, I should say. They'll say, that's not true. You don't have to have morality without God. Yes, you do. Because if you have inherent value in people, and it's somehow bad to kill other people, you have to have a reason for that. Because in any other worldview, it's the majority that tells you what's right and wrong. That's how it works. In evolutionism, in utilitarianism, in materialism, in humanism, the majority tells the minorities what good and bad mean, what is just and what is unjust. The majority sets that. They're the ones, we see that playing out right now in our culture. Anytime you see those little yard signs that get set up around the neighborhood, right? If you go around Raleigh Court and you see all those little yard signs, those are the majority culture trying to tell us what's right and wrong. They're trying to tell us what justice and what injustice should mean for us. Now, if you look at the list, it really doesn't make any sense most of the time, as it usually doesn't, because it's based off of what people want at the time. It's based off the whims of the culture, right? There's no foundation for it. It's just based off of whatever the majority says. And so it's the weak versus the strong, the majority versus the minorities. And the majority always wins out in the culture. It's just how it works. But the concept of inherent value, love, mercy, self-sacrifice, anything like that, those are all biblical concepts. Why are we born with value? Well, it's because we bear God's image. That's why. We have inherent value. Nobody in a humanist view can tell you why you have value. You just can't. The Creator has ascribed value to you. That's why you're valuable. That's why we feel that deep inside, that we have value and we deserve to be treated certain ways, right? Or don't deserve to be treated certain ways. You can write this down. You can't even have the concept of good or bad without a divine reference for what is good. You've got to have that divine reference. He's the standard. He sets the tone for what is good and bad because of his character and his nature. And again, whether we agree on what's good or not in a culture, the very fact that we have the categories belies the fact that there is some higher standard dictating to us what good and wrong, good and bad, good and evil if we want to put it in those categories, means. Now, if you're still struggling with that, I'm telling you, let's talk afterward because we go so much deeper philosophically here, okay? So come talk to me afterwards because I'd love to explain to you why you do actually believe in an objective morality, all right? The way that God's defined it. But looking back at the story, we might look in at the violence and say, well, how can God say that something like this is good? Our sense of morality tells us it's wrong or it's bad. It's not good somehow. How can a good God allow this kind of mass violence to take place here? How is it just? Well, it's certainly not something that God takes pleasure in. But again, our sense of good and evil, we have to understand, what does it mean? It's good for God's people that they are delivered from their enemies. It's not good that it has to happen through violence. And I don't think God takes pleasure in that at all. And that's not what the text says. It's not like God is up there saying, this is great. I want this to happen all over the place, right? Nowhere in the Old Testament does it ever say that. But God is going to use his people at times to punish those who deserve punishment. Because none of us would stand up here and say, hey, we don't think that bad people ought to be punished for what they've done. Do we? We would never. We always take the extreme. Let's take Hitler. It's like if Hitler had lived, would we have punished him? Would he have deserved punishment? Of course he would have. Terrible, evil, right? None of us would say that people who deserve punishment shouldn't be punished. The problem is when we're the ones that deserve the punishment, right? When the Christian faith, when God looks in and says, you all deserve punishment. That's the problem that we have. It's not the sense of good and bad. It's not the sense of right and wrong, moral good versus moral evil. One more thought before I move on. I'm telling you, I told you it was a shotgun approach, okay? It's a scattered. One more thought. It's also important to note that this kind of violence against God's enemies isn't normative for God's people. It's not because they choose to do it. It's because God has chosen for them. He's chosen to use them as an arbiter of his justice. He gets to determine who deserves punishment and who doesn't, not us. Never in the Old Testament does it say that Israel got to choose that. It's always because God used them. And guess what? God used other nations to punish Israel too, didn't he? If we recall. So again, the scales are balanced here. So we need to just look in and see what's actually going on. The point is, when we try to reject God but retain his morality or his sense of justice, we're borrowing from his categories. And if we try to deny him but borrow his categories at the same time, it's untenable. It's a philosophical fallacy, okay? So again, come talk to me afterward if you have trouble with that. Last thing, history and theology, all right? The last thing I want to give you is to consider that this is both a story that is true, it's history, but it's also theology. It's a story that's trying to get us to understand something deeper about God or ourselves or how he works in the world. And remember, the point here is that God gave his people rest from their enemies. That's the theological view. So it actually happened. It's history. There's also something greater going on here underneath the surface that we have to understand. And it's that he delivers through reversals. That's the point of the story. That's what happens here. Tapping into God's sense of justice, the enemies were going to kill and plunder Israel, and instead Israel got to kill and not plunder. They refused to plunder their enemies. Now, that's a significant part of the story, and we need to understand why, because I think what's actually going on here is a reversal of the mistake that Israel made earlier on in their nationhood as a people. If you remember, I referenced this a few weeks ago with Saul, King Saul. That was the first king of Israel, right? Well, God was going around using his people as an arbiter of his justice. And he told Saul to go against the Amalekites, who were an evil people that God gets to define that. He was punishing them. He used Israel to do that. It doesn't look pretty, but that's what he did. And he told Saul to not take any plunder from them and to kill every single one of them. Men, women, and children, and even the animals. Like wipe them completely out. Again, that sounds icky to us, but that's what he told Saul to do for his glory, in his justice. And what did Saul do? He didn't obey, right? He actually took plunder for himself, and he left people alive, including King Agag. And that's why we talk about this, because Haman was an Agagite, right? Say that 5 times fast. So Saul didn't obey, not because he felt bad for the people. It wasn't because he looked in and said, God, that's unjust. I'm not going to do that. He did it for his own ego and his own self-treasure. He wanted to put money in his treasure, right? He wanted to keep the best things for himself. And so what we see here is Esther being a better Saul. She's reversing that script because not only do they kill all of God's enemies here, like Saul should have in obedience to God, but they see him taking no plunder as well. So that's an important part because God told them not to take any stuff from the Agagite or from the Amalekites. And so we see this reversing of disobedience happening. We see obedience coming into play. And though God gave his people rest from their enemies through violence in this story in Esther, theologically, it begins to show us something much deeper about how God is reversing the curse over all of humanity for all of time. Because it's a different kind of violence that he's going to be able to deliver his people through in the future here. It's not violence that comes through conquering a people group or through a world war or through physical violence of any kind, through any human means here, like what we see in some of the Old Testament stories. They're all pointing us to something greater about how God's going to deliver. See, the way that we look at it is when he does this for like the people in Esther, they have rest from their enemies. That's what the text literally said. They have rest because they've killed all their enemies. There's no more enemies to fight against them in this case. But that rest never lasts, right? That kind of rest fades over time through violence. If we get that rest through violence, it fades. God did this throughout history, but it never seemed to stick for his people. And before we're tempted to look in and say, well, didn't God know that this kind of rest wouldn't be, eternal for them or wouldn't last, that he would give them rest from their enemies by allowing them to conquer their enemies methodically throughout their history? Well, yeah, God realized that. And what I'm telling you is that theologically, he is trying to get his people to see that I'm going to deliver you in a greater way one day. See how this rest doesn't last? Here in Esther, it's not going to last. But I'm going to give you rest over time in a greater way. And it's not through doing violence to your enemies or to my enemies. It's through doing violence to myself on behalf of all of my enemies. That's what our God says. Reverses the curse over all of humanity. See, the same God who at times uses nations to judge other nations and who works through broken and evil people to accomplish his purposes in the world in ways we don't fully understand, he also sent his own son into the world to ultimately give his people rest from their greatest enemy, sin and death, right? So you can write this down. We're our own worst enemy. We're our own worst enemy. We're all enemies of God because we all reject his authority over us. We don't want God to dictate morality in our life. We don't want his ways to be right. We don't want his justice to be our sense of justice. We want to determine and define what all of that means for ourselves. And guys, that makes us our own worst enemy. Because we're trying to rebel against a God who it just is over all things. And we keep trying to kick against that. And it makes us our own worst enemy because our pride is that thing that keeps us from embracing his good design for our lives. He's telling us what's good, and we constantly reject it. We're the ones with the problem, not God. We look in and say, that's unjust. You don't know what justice is. That's what the Bible just told us, right? Now, I feel the same way before you start getting angry at me for having a direct way of saying that. I feel the same way. I'm like, God, why? Why do you allow these things to happen? I have that come up in my own life, and when I read Romans 9, he says, you don't know what justice is, Carter. You have no idea. And I have to come to terms with that. I'm my own worst enemy there. I have to be able to put all that down before God and say, you're right. Because by default, I want to reject God's sense of good. And so what that means is I deserve some kind of eternal punishment for that. And you say, whoa, that just took a turn. Yeah, but we deserve death and destruction in an eternal sense because we've rejected an eternally good God. If he's the God of goodness, if he's the God of life, and we reject him and his authority, we're rejecting goodness in life. That's just how it works. That's the logical way to view it here. And listen, when Christians say that, though, I want to give you a caveat, all right? Listen to me. Lock in for just a second, because that doesn't mean you deserve the bad things that happen to you. And I feel like Christians all the time be like, well, I just deserved that. No, listen, you don't deserve the bad things that happen to you. That's called injustice. And the two things are not mutually exclusive. What I want you to understand is you don't deserve the bad. Let me use Esther as the example. She didn't deserve to be trafficked by the king. She had inherent value as a human being, bearing God's image. She did not deserve to have her life ripped away from her. No, she didn't deserve to have that happen, but she did start to make some mistakes after that, didn't she? What happened after
that bad thing happened, she's held accountable for. She started to reject. She even denied the God that was her creator. Remember that. She denied her Jewishness. That means she denied God. She deserves death for that. You see how that works? We don't deserve listen, if this helps clarify it, we don't deserve the bad things that happen to us at the hands of others, but we do deserve whatever happens to us at the hands of a just and holy God. That's how it works. Just like Mordecai, we'll care more about power and position and wealth for our children than giving them godly advice to live on mission for him. Right? That's what Mordecai did with Esther. You remember that? He gave her some really bad advice. Hey, why don't you hide that you're Jewish? Don't let anybody know that and win the game. Remember? That's what we'll do with our kids too. Now, she wasn't his child, but he was her guardian. And we'll say, hey, listen, why don't you go to a good college? Why don't you make a lot of money so that you can be really comfortable? Instead of saying, hey, why don't you live on mission for God and why don't you care about him more than anything else? We'll do that. And you know what? That deserves God's judgment. And that's hard for me as a parent. And just like Esther, we'll assimilate so far into the culture that's even hurt us that we might even hide who we are if we say we're Jesus followers. Be honest. Do the people that you work with or interact with on a daily basis or live next to in your neighborhood, do they even know that you serve King Jesus as your final authority? Maybe they don't know that because he's not really your final authority, even though you think he is. I don't know. Or are you just playing the cultural game here? Because listen, if you are, that deserves death. That deserves punishment. Just like Haman, we're prideful. And we find our identity in our material wealth or our position or the power that we have rather than in God. Remember, we talked about that last week. That's idolatry. And guess what? Idolatry deserves God's judgment. It deserves death. When we reject an eternal God, it necessitates an eternal judgment. And we can cry unfair all we want, but it's his world. And it would be disturbing if God didn't punish those who deserved it, because that would be unjust. But you know what I find even more disturbing, I think? And this is where we start to get into the hope that Christians have. And this is what's disturbing, is the very fact that he would actually forgive people who have rejected him and deserve the punishment. It's kind of disturbing if you think about it. That kind of mercy, not giving us what we deserve, that kind of grace extending us a life that we certainly don't deserve, that's a little disturbing if you think. It starts to mess with us a little bit. Grace is kind of hard to believe in. It's that disturbing thing that we don't deserve rest, and yet he's giving it to us anyway. That's the kind of God that is put forth in Esther here. It's a God that's loving anyway. It's a people that don't deserve it, and yet he loves them, and he delivers them from their enemies, and he gives them rest from their enemies. Man, that starts to mess with us a little bit. That should be disturbing to us. His grace conquers our greatest enemy. That sin and that death and that shame and that guilt that we carry with us, it conquers all of that on our behalf. And what God shows us throughout human history and ultimately through the Bible is that Jesus is the way that he does that. He's the way that he conquers all of that for us. He's the way, the truth, and the life, right? Here's how one pastor I heard put this, Father Tim Keller, okay? He said, you do violence to an earthly enemy and it'll give you rest from that enemy for a time, right? You might beat them down, but they'll rise back up, more your enemy than before, because now there's vengeance in their hearts. Or you can kill them all, like we see here in this, but maybe their children might rise up if you miss some of their descendants, or maybe their allies will rise up against you and still continue to war against you because, listen, the cycle of violence and killing just continues on. Violence begets violence. And what God is saying through Esther is there's a better way. The God of the Bible gave us this better way, and it's through Jesus. If Jesus would have taken a sword to the Romans and overthrown the Roman Empire because they were the enemies of the Jews at the time that he was on the earth, he would have been just and right to do that, but that's not what he did because he knew that that wouldn't give us ultimate rest, the rest that we're all longing for. So what did he do instead? Jesus didn't conquer our earthly enemies. He conquered enmity on our behalf. The hostility between us and God that creates the hostility between us and others. He conquered that through his death. This is what Ephesians 2 says. He's our peace who made both groups, both Jews and non-Jews, one. And he tore down the dividing wall of hostility, that's enmity, in his flesh. He made no effect the law consisting of commands and expressed in regulations, so that he might create in himself one new man from the two, resulting in peace. He did this so that he might reconcile both to God in one body through the cross, by which he put the hostility to death. That's what our Jesus did. And here's what I want you to write down. And this will be our final point as we start to begin to close together. Jesus did violence to our sin by allowing violence to befall him. That's what this story points us to see. He allowed violence to be done to him, God's justice to fall on him, so that we could gain that freedom and that life and that goodness that we don't deserve. That's grace. He's giving us something we don't deserve. Because of Jesus, violence is turned on its head here, and it becomes the means of our salvation when it's done to him rather than to us. And now that Jesus has conquered our greatest enemy, he's waiting for us to respond. Maybe you're here today and you're still listening just from a distance. You feel like you're on the outskirts. Maybe you're listening online even, and you just feel like you're on the outskirts. You're just looking in and peering in to say, what do these Christians believe? Maybe you haven't made this faith your own. Maybe it's something else. I don't know. Maybe you're just struggling with the dirty underbelly that we feel like we see here, right? Maybe you need to start looking at your own dirty underbelly. Maybe you need to start seeing how you've rejected God and how you've been wrong. Maybe you need to turn to him because he's offering you this beautiful grace, this violent grace that will radically change your life. Because that's what grace does to our hearts. It really starts to mess with us on the inside and does violence to our sin in our own heart. And here's what grace will do. It will push us to one of two things. Either we're going to accept the grace and the violence that God is doing in us through that grace, and it's going to transform us for his good. Or we're going to continue to fight against it, and we're going to reject it for so long that it does violence in a different way, and we're ultimately going to have to pay for our own sins. We're going to stand before God in judgment instead of Jesus doing that on our behalf. It pushes us to one of those two things. Let me give you this commentary from Victor Hugo's famous story, Les Mis. Anybody Les Miserables fans here? Anybody like Les Mis? There's a few, yeah. Listen, if you haven't read the story, you need to go read this. It's fantastic. It shows us about this violent grace. You might remember it, Jean Valjean, the protagonist. He's the one that's a convict for 19 years for stealing bread to feed his family. And it hardens him over time. And so he starts to see himself as guilty. He is a convict who doesn't deserve grace, doesn't deserve love. He's a hardened man, and he finally gets out. And everybody views him with disdain, and everybody's keeping a distance from him except for this one bishop who invites him into his home. Remember this part of the story? At the very beginning of the story. And the bishop invites him in, gives him food and clothes, and Jean Valjean is just kind of blown away. But he's still in his hardened heart as he's wrestling with it. He's wrestling with the grace that's been shown to him. And so ultimately what he does is he decides to steal the silver out of the man's cupboard, out of the bishop's cupboard, and he leaves. He climbs the garden wall, and he gets out by night, and when they wake up, he's gone, and the housemaid says he's stolen all of the stuff. But as grace tends to do, it pursues. And so grace pursued Jean Valjean in the form of police officers who found him on the road and arrested him and immediately recognized the silver that he had was the bishop's. So they took him back to the bishop for prosecution. And what did the bishop do? The bishop showed him grace. He said, not only did I give you the silver, but you forgot the candlesticks too. Sorry. It's an emotional story. When Tamara and I went and watched the movie, several years ago that came out, the musical, we just wept the entire time. We got in and we just started weeping from the very beginning. So it's hard for me to recount the story without just being overwhelmed by the sense of grace, because listen to what he said. I'll quote the story. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb, being shown this grace. He took the two candlesticks mechanically with a bewildered air, and the bishop said, now go in peace. By the way, when you return, my friend, it's not necessary to pass through the garden. You can always enter and depart through the street door. It's never fastened with anything but a latch, either by day or by night. And then turning to the police, the The bishop said, "You may retire, gentlemen," and they retired. And Jean Valjean was like a man on the point of fainting. The bishop drew near to him and he said in a low voice, "Do not forget, never forget, that you have promised to use this money in becoming an honest man." And Jean Valjean, who had no recollection of ever having promised anything, he remained speechless. The bishop had emphasized the words when he uttered them. And he resumed with solemnity, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It's your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God." And it really messed with Valjean, right? As grace often does. It did violence in his heart. It assaulted him. It twisted up inside. And from that point on, it was this struggle that's going on. And I want to continue to quote what it says. When Jean Valjean left the bishop's house, he was, as we have seen, quite thrown out of everything that he'd been thought hitherto. He could not yield to the evidence of what was going on within him. So he hardened himself against the angelic action and the gentle words of the old man. He was fighting, he was battling. This recurred to his mind unceasingly, though. This, what the bishop had said to him, and it recurred to him. To this celestial kindness, he opposed pride, which is the fortress of evil within us. He didn't want it, right? He didn't want the grace. He was indistinctly conscious that the pardon of this priest was the greatest assault and the most formidable attack which had moved him yet. It assaulted him. It did violence to the sin that was in him. And it goes on to say, as he wrestles, did a voice whisper in his ear that he had just passed the solemn hour of his destiny? That there no longer remained a middle course for him? He couldn't be on the fence any longer. That if he were not henceforth the best of men, he would be the worst. That it behooved him now, so to speak, to mount higher than the bishop or to fall lower than himself as the convict. That if he wished to become good, he must become an angel. That if he wished to remain evil, he must become a monster. The grace assaulted him to the point where he realized that he had to make a choice. He had to live for God in that grace, or he had to reject it altogether, and it would totally destroy him in the end. He saw that, because that's what grace does. It causes this violent struggle within us. Maybe if you're a Jesus follower here, you remember that point where you struggled with God. And listen, if you're not a Jesus follower yet, maybe that struggle's happening to you right now. I know that for a fact, because I experienced it myself. What I want you to see is that Jesus has done this for us so that you can have goodness in life. If you'll yield to him and yield that evil, broken heart that you have, he'll mold you and shape you into a heart of flesh for his glory. But if you don't yield to him today, right now perhaps, it might harden your heart to a point where you will no longer be able to accept him. Now, I don't know what that looks like. Maybe you'll have it till the end of your life. But what I want you to hear is that he's calling you right now. Don't put that off. Today's the day to yield. He's conquered your greatest enemy. Sit in that grace. Let's pray. God, just pray that you'll help us today. We desperately need you in this heavy sermon to end our Esther series, God. Heavy truths, hard truths. Certainly, we don't like to hear them. I don't like to preach them, if I'm being honest. It certainly is not the way that you would necessarily grow a church, right? Necessarily want to bring people in, and yet, God, you've given us these truths to wrestle with so that your grace will do violence to the sin in our heart. God, I pray that through the gospel of grace today, you will save people under the sound of my voice. God, I know there's a violent struggle going on in somebody here today, somebody listening online today. And I pray, God, that you'll set them free from that. God, help us to see what you did in Esther for your people, to give them rest from their enemies. Help us to see that you will apply that to us in an instant if we'll simply see you as our true King. God, help us to lay down our pride. Help us to lay down our desire to be like the culture. Help us to lay down anything else that we would live for and to live for you today. We need you, God. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks so much for listening with us today. We hope that it was an encouragement to you. But we don't see this as a replacement for gathering with other believers in a local church context. And so if you don't have a local church, we would encourage you to plug in with one wherever you are. And if you're in Roanoke, Virginia, we'd love to invite you to plug in with us here at Redemption Church. And you're welcome anytime to gather with us. But you can check us out online at our website, redemptionroanoke.com. You can look for other content or resources there. But thanks again for listening.